At 15, Corey Haim was making millions for Hollywood, was one of the most famous teenagers on Earth. His face sold millions of movie tickets, magazines, and posters across the world. He starred in over 20 films. By his early 20s, Hollywood had already labeled him difficult and finished. He earned fame before he understood childhood, and paid for it with addiction, depression, and isolation. Hollywood made him a star. Then it watched him disappear, slowly, quietly, and alone. Corey Haim wasn't just a famous teenager. He was a business model. In the late 1980s, Hollywood discovered that Corey could sell everything. Movie tickets, magazine covers, posters, even lunchboxes. Studios didn't see a child. They saw a product that worked. By the time Corey turned 18, he had already spent nearly a decade living on film sets, hotel rooms, and press tours, surrounded by adults, contracts, and expectations no child was prepared to carry. There were no pause buttons, no safety nets. When the roles stopped coming, the attention disappeared just as fast. Hollywood didn't ask why he was struggling. It simply moved on. What followed wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a slow erasure. Corey's story exposes a brutal truth about fame at a young age. The industry celebrates children who succeed early, but abandons them the moment they become inconvenient. And once the cameras are gone, there is no script for what happens next. Corey Haim didn't lose his career overnight. He lost something far more valuable: the chance to grow up safely. Before Corey Haim became a face on posters and magazine covers, he was a quiet, sensitive boy growing up in Toronto, Canada. Born in 1971, Corey wasn't raised with dreams of Hollywood glory. He wasn't a child chasing fame. He was a child eager to please, deeply emotional, and hungry for approval. Those traits would later make him magnetic on screen. They would also make him dangerously vulnerable. Corey entered acting young, not because he demanded it, but because adults around him recognized something rare: a natural ability to express pain, innocence, and longing without effort. On camera, he didn't pretend to feel. He felt. Very early on, his identity became tied to performance. Praise came when he delivered. Attention followed when he succeeded. Love, at least the kind he understood, became conditional. As his roles grew, so did the distance between Corey and a normal childhood. School became secondary. Friendships were temporary. Structure was replaced by travel schedules, auditions, and adult conversations he wasn't equipped to process. Unlike most children, Corey learned early that mistakes had consequences far beyond disappointment. A bad performance didn't mean a second chance. It meant fewer calls, fewer roles, fewer reasons for people to stay. There was no room to fail quietly, no space to grow slowly. Hollywood rewarded him for emotional openness, but offered no tools to protect it. He was encouraged to dig into feelings of sadness, fear, and isolation, yet never taught how to close those wounds afterward. What looked like confidence on screen masked a fragile internal world. Corey wasn't building resilience. He was surviving moment to moment. By the time he reached his early teens, the line between who Corey was and who he was expected to be had already blurred. He learned how to smile on command, how to say the right things in interviews, how to appear grateful, even when overwhelmed. But no one taught him how to say no. No one explained how to protect himself in rooms full of power, money, and unchecked authority. Adults controlled his schedule. Adults controlled his image. Adults controlled his future. And yet when pressure began to show, when anxiety surfaced, when exhaustion crept in, Corey was treated not as a child in distress, but as a professional who needed to hold it together. This was the foundation of his life. Success without safety, praise without protection. Corey Haim didn't lose his childhood in one dramatic moment. It was taken piece by piece, through expectation, silence, and normalization of what should never been normal for a child. By the time the world knew his name, the most important part of Corey's development had already been interrupted. And the tragedy is this: everything that made him special as a performer was exactly what made him unprotected as a child. So, when did Corey Haim stop being a child? Not when he signed his first contract. Not when his face appeared on movie posters. But the moment Hollywood realized he could carry a film and decided to treat him like an adult long before he became one. By his early teens, Corey was no longer being cast because he was talented. He was being cast because he was reliable. He showed up on time. He delivered emotional scenes without complaint. He made producers money. And in Hollywood, that combination changes everything. Childhood becomes a liability. Vulnerability becomes something to exploit, not protect. With films like Lucas and Silver Bullet, Corey's image crystallized. He was a sensitive outsider, the wounded boy audiences wanted to root for, the kid who could cry on cue without seeming fake. What no one asked was why it came so naturally to him. No one questioned what it meant for a child to repeatedly access feelings of rejection, loneliness, and fear, then be sent back to a trailer alone once the camera stopped rolling. This was the beginning of Corey's separate path, a life divided from his peers. While other kids worried about school dances and homework, Corey worried about box office numbers and whether a role would keep his momentum alive. Normal mistakes weren't allowed. A bad audition wasn't just disappointing, it was dangerous. In an industry that moves fast and forgets faster, falling behind meant disappearing. The pressure didn't come with warnings. It came wrapped in opportunity. Bigger roles, more attention, louder praise. Corey learned quickly that being agreeable kept doors open. Saying yes meant survival. Saying no was a luxury he didn't know he had. Adults surrounded him at all times, yet protection was strangely absent. Managers talked about branding. Studios talked about demographics. Journalists talked about heartthrob status. Everyone talked around Corey, rarely to him. He was expected to understand adult stakes without adult tools. Expected to perform confidence while quietly absorbing fear. As his career accelerated, so did the isolation. School became fragmented. Friendships faded. Relationships were transactional, tied to projects and proximity. The world grew smaller, limited to sets, hotel rooms, and press junkets. The applause was loud but fleeting. When it ended, silence filled the space. This was also the period when Corey learned a dangerous lesson. Discomfort was something to push through. Exhaustion was weakness. Anxiety was unprofessional. If he struggled, the solution wasn't rest, it was endurance. And endurance, without boundaries, becomes self-erasure. Hollywood rewarded him for emotional honesty on screen, yet demanded emotional suppression of it. He was praised for appearing vulnerable, then criticized for being vulnerable in real life. The contradiction was never explained. It was simply enforced. When people later asked how Corey lost control so early, the answer was hidden in plain sight. Control was never his to begin with. Schedules were decided for him. Image was shaped for him. Success was measured externally. His sense of self became dependent on validation. He couldn't regulate or replace. By the time the Lost Boys arrived, Corey was already standing at the edge of something irreversible. He had learned how to perform pain convincingly, but not how to process it. He had learned how to be loved by millions, but not how to feel safe when alone. The system had trained him to equate worth with visibility, relevance with survival. And this is where the questions from earlier find their answers. Why did Corey seem older than his age? Because he was forced to be. Why did he struggle when the fame slowed down? Because his identity had been built on motion, not stability. Why did anyone step in? Because as long as the machine was working, no one wanted to interrupt it. This was the moment Corey crossed from being a child actor into becoming a commodity, not publicly, but psychologically. From here on, every success raised the stakes, and every stumble carried consequences he wasn't prepared to manage. The tragedy isn't that Corey chose his path. It's that the path closed behind him before he understood where it led. Childhood doesn't end when fame begins. It ends when protection disappears. And by the mid-1980s, Corey Haim was moving forward without a safety net, without a pause button, and without the freedom to fail quietly. He was still smiling for cameras, still charming in interviews, still delivering exactly what audiences wanted. But internally, something essential had already been compromised. Not broken yet, just displaced, waiting. And from this point on, every step forward would carry a cost, one that Hollywood would never help him pay. By the late 1980s, Corey Haim wasn't just successful, he was unavoidable. His face was everywhere. Movie posters, teen magazines, television interviews, fan mail by the thousands. With the Lost Boys, Corey crossed a line few child actors ever reach. He became a cultural moment, not a rising star, a phenomenon. Studios now marketed films around his presence. Audiences didn't just watch Corey Haim. They felt like they knew him. On screen, he embodied vulnerability with a magnetic sincerity. He wasn't the loud hero or the untouchable alpha. He was the boy audiences wanted to protect. The one who looked like he felt things too deeply for his own good. That emotional openness made him iconic. It also made him exposed. Hollywood celebrated him as a teen idol, but what it really celebrated was predictability. Corey delivered exactly what the system needed. Strong box office appeal, emotional credibility, and a clean image that could be packaged, sold, and repeated. Each success raised expectations. Each expectation narrowed his freedom. The world saw confidence. Behind the scenes, Corey felt pressure closing in. Fame had a rhythm, and it didn't slow down for anyone. Public appearances blurred into press tours. Interviews recycled the same questions. Smile here, laugh there, be grateful, always grateful. Gratitude became a performance of its own. At this stage, Corey's life was built entirely around momentum. Stop moving and you risk being replaced. Stop smiling and you invite rumors. The industry didn't demand perfection. It demanded consistency. And consistency, when tied to adolescence, becomes a trap. The irony was cruel. Corey was admired for being emotionally authentic on screen, yet expected to suppress those same emotions off camera. Vulnerability sold tickets. But vulnerability in real life made people uncomfortable. So he learned to separate the two. The boy who cried convincingly for a role, and the teenager who swallowed fear and confusion to remain employable. His partnership with Corey Feldman intensified everything. Together, the two Coreys became a brand. Interviews turned into performances. Their friendship became content. The line between real connection and public consumption blurred until it was almost invisible. What the audience saw as fun and chemistry was, in reality, another layer of expectation. Money came fast, but structure didn't. Fame rewarded visibility, not stability. Corey didn't develop routines grounded in safety or privacy. His world revolved around attention cycles. Applause followed by emptiness, excitement followed by exhaustion, and with no real off switch. The emptiness grew louder each time the noise faded. Hollywood loves youth, but it fears transition. As Corey aged out of the child star image, subtle shifts began to occur. Roles became harder to secure. Scripts felt repetitive. Executives stopped talking about growth and started talking about marketability. The praise softened. The patience shortened. This is where the high point quietly began to crack. Corey sensed it before anyone said it out loud. The industry that once rushed to accommodate him now hesitated. Meetings ended with vague promises. Calls weren't returned as quickly. The machine was already scanning for the next face. For a young actor whose identity was built on relevance, this shift was destabilizing. Corey had been trained to equate love with attention and worth with demand. When demand wavered, so did a sense of self. Anxiety didn't appear suddenly. It accumulated, layer by layer, beneath the surface of success. Yet outwardly, nothing seemed wrong. The movies were still coming. Fans were still cheering. Magazine covers still framed him as the perfect teenage dream. But internally, Corey was struggling to reconcile two realities: the public image of endless success and the private fear of becoming disposable. The peak of fame didn't give Corey security. It gave him altitude. And the higher he climbed, the further he stood from anything solid. There were no systems in place to prepare him for descent. No guidance for what happens when applause fades. No acknowledgement that a teenager carrying adult expectations might eventually collapse under their weight. This was the cruelest aspect of his peak. From the outside, Corey Haim looked like someone living a dream. From the inside, he was beginning to realize that the dream had rules he didn't write and consequences he didn't understand. Hollywood had elevated him quickly, but it hadn't invested in his longevity as a human being. The industry cared about what he could deliver now, not who he would become later. And as the glow of his stardom reached its brightest point, the foundation beneath it was already eroding. This wasn't the fall yet. This was the calm before it. The height of Corey Haim's fame didn't mark the moment he lost everything. It marked the moment he had the most to lose. and the least protection to survive what came next. The collapse didn't begin with a scandal. It began with silence. The calls slowed. The roles narrowed. Meetings that once felt urgent became tentative. Hollywood didn't announce that Corey Haim was becoming inconvenient. It simply behaved as if he already was. For someone raised inside constant validation, that shift was devastating. He wasn't prepared for ambiguity. He had been trained for applause. As the attention thinned, pressure intensified. Corey was still expected to show up as a version of himself the audience remembered. Even as the industry quietly moved on, youth had been his currency, and now it was depreciating. There was no manual for this transition, no support system to absorb the shock. What remained was fear, not of failure, but of irrelevance. This is where coping turned into dependence, not as rebellion, not as indulgence, but as relief. Relief from anxiety that never switched off. Relief from expectations that followed him everywhere. Relief from the growing realization that the system which once celebrated him had no interest in catching him if he fell. When pressure becomes constant, numbness starts to feel like control. Hollywood has a way of reframing distress as dysfunction. Instead of asking what was happening to Corey, the industry began labeling him unreliable, difficult, complicated. Words that shift responsibility away from the environment and onto the individual. Once those labels stick, compassion evaporates. Doors don't slam. They simply don't open. Behind the scenes, Corey's internal world was fracturing. His sense of self had been built on being needed. When he was no longer essential, he struggled to locate value elsewhere. This is a hidden cost of early fame. Identity formed around performance rather than presence. Without an audience, he didn't feel grounded. Without momentum, he felt exposed. Attempts to slow down were interpreted as weakness. Requests for space were met with impatience. The industry rewards resilience only when it's invisible. Struggle is tolerated only if it doesn't interrupt production. Corey learned that expressing pain didn't bring support. It brought consequences. So he learned to hide it. Isolation deepened. Relationships became conditional. People appeared when opportunities existed and vanished when they didn't. Trust eroded. The world began to feel transactional, even hostile. For someone who had grown up surrounded by adults with power over his future, this reinforced a dangerous belief. Survival depended on compliance. As his career options narrowed, scrutiny increased. Every misstep was magnified. Every rumor gained traction. The narrative shifted from golden boy to cautionary tale, and Corey felt it, not as public humiliation, but as private erosion. Confidence didn't shatter. It thinned, gradually, until doubt occupied most of the space. This phase is often misunderstood. From the outside, it looks like self-destruction. From the inside, it feels like self-preservation. When the nervous system has lived too long under threat, calm becomes unfamiliar. Chaos feels normal. Stability feels fragile. Corey wasn't chasing oblivion. He was trying to quiet the noise long enough to breathe. What made this period especially brutal was a lack of accountability above him. The same structures that profited from his openness offered no framework for repair. There were no safeguards for mental health, no protocols for transition, no recognition that a teenager raised inside adult pressure might falter without guidance. Responsibility was individualized. Context was ignored. As time passed, Corey sensed that redemption, at least in Hollywood terms, required an impossible standard. He needed to be healed, grateful, marketable, and silent, all at once. The industry loves comeback stories, but only when they're clean. Real recovery is messy, slow, and unpredictable. Corey's reality didn't fit the narrative. This is the point where survival became a daily negotiation, not just against addiction or depression, but against a system that had already written him off. Hope didn't disappear, but it became conditional. Each attempt to re-enter the industry carried the risk of rejection, reinforcing the cycle of anxiety and withdrawal. The darkest truth is this: Corey Haim didn't fall because he lacked discipline. He fell because he was asked to function as an adult before he had the tools to become one, then judged for struggling once the spotlight moved on. The collapse wasn't sudden. It was engineered through neglect. By the time the public noticed something was wrong, the damage had already been done quietly, over years. This wasn't a breaking point. It was a breaking process. And it set the stage for the most painful realization of all, that the system which created him had no intention of helping him heal. As the years passed, the distance between who Corey Haim had been and who he was allowed to become grew unbearable. The industry remembered a frozen image, the teenage idol, the vulnerable boy on screen, but had no patience for the adult who carried unresolved wounds. Aging for a former child star wasn't growth, it was disqualification. Every attempt Corey made to stabilize his life was undermined by the same contradiction. He was told to get better, but not to slow down, to recover, but not to inconvenience anyone, to take responsibility, but without acknowledgement of the environment that shaped him. Recovery, framed this way, became another performance with impossible expectations. Public perception hardened. Headlines simplified a complex struggle into a familiar narrative. Troubled former child star, wasted potential. Labels that reduced years of pressure, neglect, and psychological erosion into personal failure. The audience moved on, reassured by the idea that this was an individual problem, not a systemic one. What few understood was how deeply Corey's nervous system had been conditioned. From an early age, he learned that love arrived through achievement and disappeared without warning. That safety was temporary. That rest was earned, not given. Living under those rules for too long rewires a person. Calm feels suspicious. Stability feels undeserved. The body remains on alert even when the danger has passed. This is where relapse, in any form, becomes tragically predictable, not because of weakness, but because the internal architecture was never designed for peace. Corey wasn't sabotaging himself. He was trapped in patterns that once helped him survive, but now kept him stuck. The tools he needed had never been provided. Attempts to tell his story were met with resistance or dismissal. The industry prefers silence over accountability. Acknowledging harm threatens a mythology of opportunity and success. Corey's truth complicated that story, and complications are rarely welcomed in Hollywood, so his voice was minimized, reframed, or ignored. Isolation deepened into invisibility. Invitations stopped. Networks dissolved. The sense of being watched, once overwhelming, vanished almost entirely. For someone whose existence had been validated through visibility, this absence felt like erasure, not just of his career, but of his worth. Yet even here, Corey continued to fight for agency. He sought treatment. He spoke about wanting a different future. He tried to reclaim authorship over his own narrative. But recovery is not linear, especially when the world only acknowledges success at the finish line. Each setback reinforced the belief that redemption was always one step out of reach. What makes this phase especially painful is how quietly it unfolded. There was no single scandal to point to, no dramatic implosion that demanded intervention. Instead, there was a slow accumulation of loss. Opportunity, trust, confidence, belonging, the kind of damage that doesn't trend but destroys lives all the same. Hollywood's final betrayal wasn't cruelty. It was indifference. The system didn't actively push Corey away. It simply stopped noticing him. And for someone raised inside constant attention, indifference was the most devastating response of all. It confirmed the fear he had carried since childhood, that without usefulness, he was invisible. This is the moment the earlier questions fully converge. Why couldn't Corey escape the cycle? Because the cycle was built before he had a choice. Why did help arrive too late? Because it was never prioritized when it mattered most. Why does a story still feel uncomfortable? Because it exposes a truth the industry prefers not to face. That talent without protection is exploitation. Corey Haim didn't lose control because he lacked willpower. He lost control because he was never given control in the first place. His life was shaped by forces far larger than individual decisions, forces that demanded output without providing care. When the cost finally became visible, the profit had already been taken. This was not the end of Corey's story, but it was the lowest point of its internal arc, the place where hope became fragile, where survival required more strength than fame ever had. And it is here in this darkness that the question shifts from what went wrong to what it would take to rebuild something human from a wreckage. Because even at his lowest, Corey Haim was not finished. The industry may have moved on, but the story wasn't over yet. If collapse is loud, rebuilding is almost always quiet. For Corey Haim, there was no dramatic comeback moment, no triumphant return to center stage. What followed his lowest point was something far less cinematic and far more honest, a slow, uncertain attempt to reclaim control over a life that had never truly felt like his own. This phase didn't begin with confidence. It began with exhaustion. Corey was tired of surviving on adrenaline, tired of being defined by other people's expectations, tired of watching his past replayed while his present was ignored. The desire to change didn't come from optimism. It came from necessity. He entered treatment not as a publicity move, but as a last line of defense. Recovery, for Corey, wasn't about becoming a better version of his former self. It was about learning who he was without the machinery of fame pushing him forward. That process was disorienting. Without cameras, schedules, and scripts, silence became unavoidable, and silence forced reflection. For the first time, Corey had to sit with emotions he had spent years suppressing: fear, anger, grief, a sense of betrayal that had no clear target. Healing meant acknowledging not only what he had done to cope, but what had been done to him. That distinction mattered. Responsibility and blame are not the same, and for years, they have been collapsed into one. He spoke openly, at times painfully so, about wanting accountability from an industry that preferred distance, not revenge, not spectacle, just acknowledgement. But even here, the response was complicated. Some listened, many didn't. Hollywood has a short memory for anything that disrupts its narrative of opportunity and success. Career-wise, the road back was narrow. The roles available to Corey were smaller, often defined by his past rather than his potential. The industry offered reminders of who he used to be, rarely space to show who he was becoming. Each opportunity came with an unspoken test. Could he still be profitable, predictable, contained? What mattered more than the size of the roles was the intention behind them. Corey wasn't chasing relevance anymore. He was chasing agency, the ability to choose, the right to step away without punishment, the freedom to exist without constant evaluation. These goals don't make headlines, but they are the foundation of real recovery. This period was not linear. Progress came in fragments. Steps forward were followed by setbacks that reignited old doubts. The difference was that Corey now recognized a pattern. He understood that healing wasn't about erasing the past, but about changing his relationship to it. Fame had once been his identity. Now it was a chapter, painful, formative, but not definitive. Public reaction remained mixed. Sympathy existed alongside skepticism. The world is uncomfortable with imperfect recovery. It prefers clear endings, redemption, or ruin. Corey's reality sat in between. He was alive, trying, vulnerable, and still struggling. That ambiguity made people uneasy. Yet something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, Corey was speaking from his own voice rather than a script handed to him. He wasn't performing resilience. He was practicing it, quietly, imperfectly, without guarantees. This phase answers a critical question the story has been circling since the beginning. Was Corey Haim capable of change? The answer is yes, but change doesn't undo damage. It doesn't restore lost years or erase conditioned fear. What it offers instead is choice. And for someone whose life had been controlled since childhood, choice was revolutionary. Rebirth in this context doesn't mean rising higher than before. It means standing upright without being pushed. It means defining success internally rather than borrowing it from applause. Corey wasn't rebuilding a career. He was rebuilding permission. Permission to be human, inconsistent, unfinished. The tragedy is that this work began late, after decades of pressure had already left deep marks. But its existence matters. It challenges the idea that broken trajectories are inevitable. It shows that even after prolonged neglect, the impulse toward healing remains. Corey's turning point wasn't a moment the world noticed. It was a private recalibration, a decision to stop measuring himself by the industry that had failed to protect him, to stop waiting for validation that might never come, to begin valuing survival not as weakness, but as strength earned under impossible conditions. This wasn't victory, but it was movement. And in a story shaped by exploitation and abandonment, movement itself was an act of defiance. By the final chapter of Corey Haim's life, the spotlight was no longer blinding. It was distant. And in that distance, something uncomfortable happened, clarity. Not the kind that heals everything, but the kind that allows a story to be seen without illusion. Corey's later years unfolded far from the machinery that once defined him. The frantic pace was gone. The expectations were lower. What remained was a man living with the consequences of a life shaped too early by pressure and visibility. He was no longer the center of a cultural moment. He was a human being navigating survival in relative obscurity. This period is often misunderstood because it doesn't fit the arc people want. There was no grand redemption, no triumphant return that rewrote the past. There was effort, there was struggle, there were moments of stability followed by fragility. The kind of life most people live, except Corey lived it carrying the psychological residue of fame that arrived before identity could form. In public memory, Corey was often frozen in time. The smiling teenager, the face from posters and VHS covers, the icon of an era that felt simpler to remember than to interrogate. That nostalgia, while affectionate, was also limiting. It allowed audiences to love the image without confronting the cost of creating it. As conversations around child stardom, mental health, and exploitation slowly began to change, Corey's story gained a different kind of weight, not because it was unique, but because it was representative. He became part of a broader reckoning, an example of what happens when talent is prioritized over protection, and success is valued more than safety. His passing didn't shock Hollywood. It saddened it, and that distinction matters. Shock implies accountability. Sadness allows distance. The response revealed how normalized these outcomes had become. Another former child star, another cautionary headline, another reminder quickly absorbed and set aside. Yet for those willing to look closer, Corey Haim's legacy isn't defined by how his life ended, but by what his life exposes. He forces a question the industry still struggles to answer. What responsibility does success carry toward the people it consumes? Corey didn't leave behind a manifesto or a movement. He left behind a pattern, one repeated across decades, across genres, across generations. Children elevated too fast. Adolescents commodified. Adults discarded once they no longer fit a profitable narrative. His story connects the past to the present in ways that remain uncomfortably relevant. In hindsight, Corey represents a transition point, a reminder of an era before safeguards were even discussed, when emotional labor from children was normalized and consequences were externalized. His life now sits at the intersection of nostalgia and accountability, a place where admiration must coexist with critique. Legacy isn't always about influence or innovation. Sometimes it's about warning. Corey Haim's legacy lives in conversations that follow his name, about consent, protection, mental health, and the unseen cost of fame. It lives in every question asked about how young is too young and what success should never require. The industry may remember him as a former star. History remembers him as evidence. Evidence that talent without protection becomes exploitation. Evidence that fame without support accelerates harm. Evidence that survival should never be mistaken for failure. Corey Haim didn't get the ending people expect from Hollywood stories. But his life still matters. Not as a tragedy to consume, but as a lesson to absorb. Because if his story is remembered honestly, it challenges the systems that made it possible, and that perhaps is the most enduring legacy of all. Corey Haim's story doesn't end with a scandal, a headline, or a single mistake. It ends with a question that still hasn't been answered. What happens when a child is taught that love arrives through performance, but never learns how to exist without it? What happens when success comes before safety and applause replaces protection? Corey didn't fail to survive Hollywood. Hollywood failed to protect a child it was eager to profit from. He wasn't weak. He was conditioned. Conditioned to perform pain before he understood it. Conditioned to equate worth with visibility. Conditioned to endure rather than heal. By the time the world noticed his struggle, the damage was already internalized. The systems that shaped him had moved on, leaving behind a narrative that blamed the individual and spared the structure. It was easier that way. It always is. Corey Haim didn't lose his way overnight. He lost it gradually, through silence, neglect, and expectations no child should carry. His life stands as a reminder that early success is not a gift when it comes without protection, and that resilience should never be demanded from those who were never given a choice. The real tragedy isn't how Corey Haim died. It's how many others followed the same path, quietly, and until the industry learns the difference between talent and responsibility. His story will never truly be over.